Imagine if last year, just before the high holidays, God had sent a messenger to you, maybe an angel, maybe Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi, to tell you about his plan to introduce a pandemic into the world in the upcoming year. Wouldn't your prayers have been different during Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur? Now you may say, I'm not sure. I take Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur very seriously. On Rosh Hashana, I crown God the King. And on Yom Kippur, I pray for another year of life for me and my family members. You can never take that for granted. And you might think, what's the difference if someone's supposed to pass away, whether they pass away in a fire or through a plague? And the answer is, there's an enormous difference. As tragic as it is, God forbid one person or a few people dying in a fire. How can you compare that to hundreds of thousands or millions of people dying in a plague? So at a minimum, your prayers would have been directed further outward on behalf of your city, your state, your country, the rest of humanity. This year, when God put on his corona, his crown, stepped out of his throne room and introduced his presence to the world like he had never done before in our lifetimes, he certainly got our attention. And in doing so, he closed down our houses of study and our houses of prayer. Maybe he was telling us that he wasn't happy with what was going on there. But how could that be? Our prayers are so sincere and our study is so intense. And now, stunningly, at least in Israel, we're faced with another lockdown on the eve of Rosh Hashana. Maybe God's saying, you didn't get the message. I'm not happy. I want something different. What could that message be? Perhaps, although we never know what God's thinking, but perhaps he's suggesting to us, if your prayers are exclusively or almost exclusively about you and your family, then why do you need to say them in a synagogue, in a shul? Just stay home and pray there. If you're going to be in a shul, in a temple, in a synagogue, with other people, then why aren't you keeping each other in mind? Not just your close friends, but the new members in the synagogue and the guests there. Maybe that was our failing, being too narrow-minded and not praying for our friends and acquaintances and the colleagues and neighborhoods and communities and cities and states and countries and Israel and the rest of humanity. All of them God's creatures. Back when the Beis HaMikdash, the holy temple, stood, each day of the holiday of Sukkot, they used to bring sacrifices on behalf of every one of the nations in the world. In fact, the sages tell us that if our non-Jewish enemies knew what was going on in the temple and the amount of protection they were getting through those sacrifices, they would have surrounded it to protect it rather than to destroy it. And so this Rosh Hashana, let's consider widening our circle of influence, widening the span of our requests to God, and keeping in mind not just ourselves and our friends, but everybody in synagogue, and everybody in all the other synagogues in our town, and all the other synagogues across the world, and our fellow Jews who aren't in synagogue. You're lucky if you know how to pray and know what the prayers mean and know why it's so important to pray during the high holidays. You have many, many fellow Jews that aren't so fortunate, who aren't praying, and who have no one to pray for them except for you. Keep them in mind, the rest of the Jewish people and the rest of the world, all of God's creatures. I want to wish each of you a happy and healthy, sweet new year. L'Shana Tova.